Hello, my name's Gregory Marler and I run a YouTube channel called Mapper Diaries. It's about me creating and improving OpenStreetMap. This video is thanks to the United Religions Initiative, URI, and they're wanting to bring knowledge of OpenStreetMap to faith traditions of the world. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm a Christian in the northeast of England, so I'll mainly fall into focusing on that because that's my knowledge and my thought. But if you're of another faith tradition or not, hopefully you can apply the bits and understand how they would be relevant to your faith and to other faiths that we have, and perhaps ones that are more popular in other parts of the world. But generally it will be about OpenStreetMap, or OSM as it's called for short. Why a map's important is probably a good question to ask before we dive into OpenStreetMap. Well, obviously they're important for getting around. If you want to find your way to a church or to a temple or a mosque, a map would be really helpful in that, or find your way to other places in relation to that faith place. And they provide local understanding, so you can know if a church is in a countryside or a town, if it's near shops or public transport. Probably when you're visiting one that you don't know, you can find out what sort of place it's in by looking at maps before you go there, so they're helpful for that. And they also provide geographic insight and decision making on this is kind of a wider level of understanding the local area. So the maps might help people decide what public transport should go there. Are there lots of faith buildings and places of worship in a certain area? Are they well served by public transport or by roads? What's the parking? Is the parking in a town particularly busy on certain days of the week because of the places that are there? So making maps that we can use for this, it's time consuming, it's tricky, and therefore it's costly. So to make a map, you need to, without using any other maps, you need to go out to the place. You need to observe what's there. You know, how do you know a church is where it is unless you've gone there and seen it? If you go into another area, like you don't know what mosques or what synagogues are there unless you visit that place or have some other information that you're allowed to use. And you need the tools to get the layouts right. So I challenge you, if you try and draw an area of where you live or where you are without using any other maps, draw the lines of the roads and perhaps other features like rivers and railways. You'll often find that, unless you've got a good memory of looking at another map anyway, you'll find that it gets squashed up and it's not accurate because maybe the road turned a bit more without you realising, or getting the distance right. You didn't realise that this road's actually longer because the road it joins is at an angle and things like that. And so there's tools that you need to use to get those right, to be able to actually trace it. Particularly if you're using it with other information, when you overlay some map data with another map data, like you want it to line up and not be squished. And you need the contextual items. So if I were to show you a map of all the churches in a town, or all the places of worship in a town, then that really doesn't tell you much. If the roads have been mapped, then that's more helpful, and perhaps place names and other things. So it's not just about creating the map of what you're interested in. You need more stuff in that context. And of course you need the systems to display, to query, and to share that information that you created. So to display that may just be getting someone to nicely draw out the map rather than your sketch while you were finding what's there. Or it may be in a digital form doing that. And to use that in kind of querying it, questioning where stuff is, you either need to take time to do that, or with computers have it in the right file formats and the right tools built around those file formats. And equally sharing, how do you share these maps and the map data with people? So all this, and then and that's just making the map and starting to use it. Then of course updating the map is also hard. You know, you don't know if roads have changed, if different things have turned up. Is other places of worship still in use? Have new ones come? Well, basically you probably got to visit the whole area again, and so to see what's changed. It's updating it can be just as hard as making the map in the first place, and therefore maps they're basically expensive and they're closed. So companies do make maps, of course, and they get people to survey this, whether they're walking or if they're using information such as cameras or planes flying over for aerial imagery. But that costs them money, and so they charge people for these maps. It might not be the end user. They might charge company to allow them to use their maps in the company system, and they'll charge them a license fee of a few £1,000s or something, depending what it is. And that will be a yearly cost. And the company that made the maps and the map data can also restrict. They can tell them how they can use it and how they can't. And so it may be free to the end user. The people paying the cost may then display ads or use other things to kind of get back that cost that they paid for making and updating the map. So you probably think before of maps being free, but they do cost a lot to make an update, and someone's paying that cost, and there's a cost somewhere there. So with maps being expensive and closed to how they can be used, this is where OpenStreetMap or OSM enters in. So around 2004, GPS became usable. GPS is Global Positioning System. There's satellites all around the Earth beaming time signals, and then a GPS device listens to those time signals and figures out how long they took, and with some basic maths and triangulation, it can find out where it is on the Earth. And so that used to be only available to the military, but around the 2000s it was opened up, available to anyone, and then devices, little handheld devices to read that information and record it became very cheap. They cost about £100 back in 2004. Now it's just a tiny chip that's included on most smartphones. So we all have a really accurate GPS, a global positioning system that doesn't require internet connectivity or to send messages. And so that allows us to pinpoint our location to sort of 3 or 5 meters, sometimes even closer. And with this technology available, several people said, well, if we can't use map data, or we've got to pay and still be restricted, we'll just make it ourselves, and then we'll share it with everyone. And hence formed OpenStreetMap around 2004. That idea of we can just do this ourselves. Some people thought they were crazy because people knew it took time and was costly and tricky, and they said OpenStreetMap will never take off. But it's still here, so let's explain what it is. Open means anyone can use it. So there are some copyright rules, but they're essentially you've got to give attribution. So you've got to say that you used OpenStreetMap, and you've got to share it in the same way. If you take OpenStreetMap data and you improve it or change the format, you've got to also share those improvements under the same rules. So anyone using your improvement would still have to credit OpenStreetMap and maybe yourselves, and they have to continue sharing it in the same way. Open also means it's not just the produced map, it's not the produced work, it's not a visual final product, it's the raw data, the information that makes the map. So actually, map is wrong in OpenStreetMap. It's not a map as such. It's a database is better described. And we use code to then display that data into different maps. So if you go on the main website, OpenStreetMap.org, you'll see on the right there's a little link to layers, and you can actually see different map styles all made from the same data. And a good example of this is we could have some code that makes motorways really grayed out and faded, and then cycle routes, make them really bold so they're obvious. Now that's the same map data, just displayed in a different way, and you've got a cycle map. In the same way, you could make a map if you wrote a bit of code and knew what you were doing, or used some tools, and you could display places of worship, whether they be synagogues or churches, or all of them. And we'll look at that a bit more closely. But then street in the middle of OpenStreetMap is also wrong, really. So it's not limited to streets, and it's not about streets. In fact, it's really wide open. So there are 4 main data types of OpenStreetMap. There are points, which we call nodes. And so that's a single place with a location. There's then lines, or ways as we call them, and they're actually joined up nodes that could be done as features, so they might be like a river or a road. If you close off a way and make it a closed area, it's an area, and so that could be a building, or perhaps a residential area, or a forest. And then there are relations, which are more complicated and for specific uses, but they kind of group those other data types together as one thing for specific use. So you got the data types that they kind of how the location information, but then for each of those, they have what we call key value pairs, or tags. And you can attach lots of those. So you have a key, which is a bit of text, and you have a value, which is a bit of text. And that describes it. So the place behind me, I could put a point here on the map, and I could use some tags. I could say it's amenity equals place of worship. And then I could go into more detail. I could say the religion is Christian. So that means we can show it on the map with a Christian cross. But I could go into more detail and even say denomination is Anglican. And so if you wanted to filter the data and just show where Anglican churches were, or you specifically wanted like directions to your nearest Anglican church, then that's all in the data and you can find it. Another helpful tag is, of course, name. And so this allows us on the map to display the name next to the symbol. So this is St. Lawrence's Church, or St. Lawrence Church. And you can add lots of those. You can add what you want. This example has actually got lots of details. It's a historic listed building as well, so it's got some tags relating to that. It's got information about the area that the church serves, so the deanery and tags such as that. And you can fill these all. They won't all relate to the main map and be used for that display, but other people can use them. There is, of course, benefit in using the same tag. So you might call amenity place of worship odd, but that's how OpenStreetMap generally does it, how a lot of people have done it, and that means that people are expecting that when they write code. And so my favorite example of this actually goes back to cycling, when some people were mapping amenity equals bicycle parking, and then someone made a cycle map and they displayed those points on their cycle map, and that meant more people around the world went and used the tag amenity bicycle parking, and they might have used other things. They might have gone parking equals bicycles or something like that. But once it was being used, once it was standardized just through community and usage, then people changed that, and amenity equals bicycle parking is what people will now use to map the cycle racks and places you can chain your bike around the world. Yeah, and so that's OpenStreetMap, but there's a few more points. It's collaborative like Wikipedia. So if I map the roads around the area, you can then map the churches, and you didn't have to map the roads, but you've got a nice map with context of them to display churches. Someone else might be not interested in churches but graveyards. Well, you've mapped the churches, so they can go and check each of those and see if they've got graveyards and map the graveyards around each church and stuff like that. So it keeps collaborative. We each build onto it. My original map with the roads, I can then display the churches if I want, and I didn't have to do all of those. I could focus on the roads, and that means also if someone, maybe you just made a map of your local churches, but if someone maps the churches elsewhere, then you could actually extend that to make a map of churches wider. So we all help each other out and do little bits. Some people do more than others, but collaborative, and it builds up together. So not everyone has to map the world. That does make it a lot easier. One difference on Wikipedia is that OpenStreetMap is very strong on something called on the ground rule. So this means that if you had to go and visit here, and I can physically see there's a church here. By the gate, there's a sign saying what kind of church it is and the name, and that can be verified on the ground. If I had opinion and thought this was a school, or thought it was a ruin, something silly like that, actually someone else could come and see on the ground it is a place of worship, people going here on Sundays, and they can see the name. So that helps avoid opinion, and it helps make it more accurate in that sense. And also a good thing about OpenStreetMap is that it updates fast. So places of worship, I guess churches and mosques and synagogues, temples, they don't change very quickly, but they do change. 14 years ago, the church I attended used to meet in a hall, and then it bought a building sort of about 3 miles away. That was an industrial warehouse, and the first public meeting we had in that building, I had updated it on OpenStreetMap as that's where the church was. So anyone looking at OpenStreetMap then would know where to go for the church. And any people new looking for a church in the following weeks would know exactly where it is. Whereas other map providers took several months to update their maps because they didn't have people there. So this is generally good, but also actually because it updates quickly, it means we can help people. It's really good in places where there's been natural or man-made disasters. So hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, they change the area. They can wash out whole villages. They can destroy roads or build or bridges that you can't use. And they can, man-made disasters as well, particularly mean populations move around, and using that, updating the maps quickly is really important for the aid agencies, people like the Red Cross associations and Red Crescent associations. They use OpenStreetMap, as do Doctors Without Borders, MSF, and lots of other organisations use OpenStreetMap because they know it can be really up to date, and if it's not, they can update it. And actually there's a process where people can help after a disaster or even before a disaster, updating the map remotely with information provided. And so people who if we care about other communities, other humans, we can update that. And that's not limited to faith groups, but I have run workshops at my church where we helped people dealing with floods, and we provided maps for aid agencies. But that's a big subject. I did a talk very recently, a video on humanitarian mapping. And so to understand that, I'd suggest you go and listen to that talk and find out and find the links to do with that. OpenStreetMap, though, as might be apparent, it does rely on volunteers. So the map will be good where they are and what they care about. So the centre of Durham city is really well mapped because I've lived here for many years, and so I've updated my local area. Also the churches and actually the other places of worship, like the Spiritualist Church and the Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall, a few mosques nearby, they're updated because I care about places. As I may have mentioned, may have been obvious, I care about cycling, so a lot of cycle features are mapped. And that's really key in understanding OpenStreetMap. Like, it's only as good as its volunteers. So if we get more volunteers, different types of volunteers, it's going to be a better map. And I'm going to talk a bit later about how we do that and in another video. There are about 8 million users registered on OpenStreetMap, and each year, so some people register, do an edit, change something and never come back. Some do a lot more, but each year there's about 300,000 people that have made changes, so active contributors as we call them. One thing I'd like to also add is that OpenStreetMap, nobody owns it as such. I like to think it very much as the church. Nobody owns that and the beliefs as such. But there are many communities and many organizations that do different things that kind of support, help people to train them up to edit OpenStreetMap or to use it. They promote OpenStreetMap. They run services and servers. So there's the OpenStreetMap Foundation that does a lot of overall work, and that runs the main servers and the main database that people edit or create copies from. But there's local groups such as OpenStreetMap UK, OpenStreetMap France, GeoLibras in Argentina, OpenStreetMap Foundation in Japan. All over the world there's these different organizations that kind of do similar stuff or have focuses locally, updating data or dealing with challenges in their region. There's also subject-specific groups, such as the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. They interact with a lot of those aid agencies that I talked about, and they say, how can we help you with maps? How can we connect with the volunteers in different places to help you? And how can we build tools to do that? And after knowing about all this, you probably want to know where OpenStreetMap is used. So you can go to the main website run by the foundation, which is openstreetmap.org, or osm.org also works. You'll see the main map there. As I explained, there's a link to look at different styles and layers. But people also use this map. They embed it on their own website. So there's been quite a few high profile ones like the US White House, and lots of smaller companies and organizations. Facebook, use it if you mention a place or create an event with a place. For most countries at least, the map will be using OpenStreetMap data. It may look a bit different because Facebook run their own code to make it into the style that matches their website, but that's using the same data that we contributed to. And apps such as Snapchat and Pokemon Go, they use OpenStreetMap and they do the same thing. They change it to work with their systems and in their style and for their purposes. So I said apps. Most of us will use a phone, and that's how we navigate, because there's that GPS chip on our phone. It knows where we are. Now, there's no official map for OpenStreetMap because nobody owns it as such. Anyone can do that. So if you search where you normally get apps, whether that's the iPhone iTunes area or the Google Play Store or the Windows App Store, and if you search for OpenStreetMap as one word, you'll find a long list of apps that people have made with different features, with different aims as well. So there's often ones for hiking apps that focus on that. There'll be ones for sat nav that kind of read out the directions for you, so you can have it running in your car and not look at the screen all the time. And it's best to look down that list because they do change, and there's a lot of healthy competition there, but they can be using the same OpenStreetMap data for different ways. It also gets used, OpenStreetMap, in print and in publications. So some people have printed the big folding maps of an area and sold those. Others have kind of put it in books that talk about locations and can include maps. You could create a leaflet of all the places of worship in your area and display them on a map and include that in a leaflet, or specifically all the churches or all the mosques. You might create a leaflet about your place of worship, your church perhaps, and it can have all the usual text and information in that, but towards the end you might want to include a little box with a map, and you can use OpenStreetMap as long as you attribute it, of course, and that can show where your church is, or your mosque or your place of worship. It's also used in logistics, so these are harder to know because they're not always publicly shared. A lot of governments will use OpenStreetMap in their tools, in their GIS department, or in their emergency services, or their planning. And they may combine it with other maps and compare, but they also use OpenStreetMap. Amazon, for example, use it for working out where to deliver, which vans to put parcels in and to deliver them to each house. So their drivers will have an app that tells them where all the delivery points are to get your parcels. And Amazon actually have staff that when their drivers say there's an issue with OpenStreetMap, they have staff to edit and improve OpenStreetMap themselves. Similarly, Grab is a big company for taxis in Singapore, and they use it for they use OpenStreetMap for figuring out where people are and how to get where they want. So their drivers will be told you can go these various ways, and they can calculate fares using the OpenStreetMap data. So used in lots of ways. Sometimes we notice these, sometimes we don't, depending whether it's something we would see or not. We can query OpenStreetMap as well, because you'll be wanting to know about that. Now that we know all this data, how can we use it? So GIS professionals, Geographic Information System, they can use software and tools that are quite advanced, so query OpenStreetMap in different ways. So they can answer questions such as like, where are the places of worship combined with other data such as population density. They could say what's the average distance it takes to travel to places of worship from a specific point. They can generate maps that are very specific and graphical, such as colouring the places of worship by their religion, or even narrowing it down into their denomination, and asking lots of questions, which is why a lot of big companies with logistics or governments in their planning will have GIS departments to do that. So it's more complicated. For us, there is an online tool that's a bit helpful called Overpass Turbo, that we can ask some basic questions, particularly if we've got knowledge of OpenStreetMap and editing it, because we'll understand those tags. So we can ask, where are the places of worship in a town, and that helps. We don't have to zoom in. It shows us. It can handle it as long as the area isn't too big. We can say where's a specific religion and its places of worship, or even getting more detailed, we can say where is a specific denomination, where are those places in the area of interest. And we can query it in different ways, but that's mainly if we understand the OpenStreetMap data. Not everything's appropriate to put into OpenStreetMap, as I said. It's got to be verifiable on the ground. You've got to be able to see it is what it is, because this, we know there's a sign at the gate, so this is a church. But also some things are private and shouldn't be shared, because if you edit and put something into OpenStreetMap, it can be seen and edited, seen and used by everyone, anyone. So even if it's not common tags, people can find it based on where it is. And so there's another online tool that I like to tell people about called UMap. This was built by the OpenStreetMap France organization and their community. And it uses essentially OpenStreetMap, even if we're not putting all our data in there, it's still good as a base map because it gives us that context of roads and rivers and even where the places of worship are. But we can display specific data on top of that without putting it in OpenStreetMap by using a tool such as UMap. Once you log in and have an account there, it's a lot easier than knowing and using the main GIS tools. So various people in my church have actually used this in some interesting ways. One is that we provide a bus service mainly for students who can't walk the 3 or 5 miles to our church each week. And this isn't a public general bus, it's just for people going to the church. So to tell them where that bus runs and more specifically where it will stop and pick them up from, we created a UMap, drew the line and the points where they are. And so people can see this, but also actually it gives them context of where the church is and they know where they're going. Which is particularly good for people new to the area and gets them more connected. Another aspect is that my church has midweek groups that meet in people's homes, small groups, and they're private. They're not a official part of the church. You know, we don't want to advertise those homes to everyone because they're not places of worship. There's not a sign saying what is. And so someone in the church created a UMap of roughly where they are, so they put the points on the street of each house group, or maybe a place, maybe the group of streets, they just put a point roughly there. But it's enough that someone that's part of the church or newly part of the church and wants to go to one of those house groups, they can look at this map and understand where they meet and go, oh, well, there's one that's somewhere close to where I live. And they can then contact the people that run that house group and ask for the exact address and can go there. Another great example is a group in the church were really focused on prayer walks for a month. They wanted to pray over the city and walk it. So they'd walk along a road and they'd pray either in their head or out loud or with the person they were walking with. And they'd pray if they saw there were shops on that street, they might pray for the local businesses, they might just pray for the residents on that street, or things like if there was a school they could see, they would pray for the children and their education doing well. And so to track this, because they were really interested in where they're praying, they were all doing it individually, they created a UMap and they drew lines over the roads of where they had prayed for, and that meant they could follow that process. They could see other people had prayed a lot for big areas, some people had done a few, and it just helped them engage, helped them see where they were praying for and also where they hadn't prayed for. So they might see, oh, we've not done that street, and the map gives them the context and they can actually pray for the street without going there, or they can go there and pray. And that was a really interesting use of UMap and with OpenStreetMap as the base map. I've talked a lot about OpenStreetMap and why it's important to update it and edit it. You're probably wanting to edit it. I would say the most important thing is check OpenStreetMap and see what's missing, because more people looking and using the map will find the issues and build the community there. But to talk about editing OpenStreetMap is a big subject in itself. So I'm going to have another video online in about a week that's gonna go at a slower pace. A lot of my videos are me mapping, and it's kind of advanced and lots of detail. But this video on editing OpenStreetMap for places of worship is going to be at the bottom level. So if you've only just heard of OpenStreetMap, which you now have, you'll be able to follow along. You'll be able to see and check if a faith-based place is missing from OpenStreetMap, and I'll tell you the easiest methods on how to get that into OpenStreetMap, and then other people can use that data. So thank you for listening. As I said, I've been Gregory Marler, and I've talked about OpenStreetMap. Hopefully now you know why maps are valuable for everyone, but also to faith-based groups and traditions. You know what? Hopefully you know what OpenStreetMap is and its value in the world. Also a bit of how we can use that data and why it's interesting. Do listen to my other video about editing OpenStreetMap if that interests you, and we can get OpenStreetMap being even better and more valuable.